Play it right, or you're out of my building." Victor Langford's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through the room, sharper than the crystal glasses clinking under the chandelier light. And just like that, the laughter folded into silence, thin and uneasy, as if the air itself had been warned not to move. A dozen executives turned their heads in slow, synchronized curiosity, some smiling, others narrowing their eyes, all of them watching the same thing now. The man in a gray maintenance uniform standing near the polished black piano, a mop bucket still resting against the marble wall behind him. Elijah Carter didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't even blink right away, his fingers loosely wrapped around a folded cloth, damp from cleaning fingerprints off surfaces no one else noticed, his name badge catching a sliver of warm light that made it glint for just a second before fading again. He wasn't supposed to be part of the evening, not in a room like this, not among tailored suits and silk dresses and voices that carried the weight of stock prices and private jets. He was supposed to move quietly, finish his shift, disappear before anyone thought to look twice. But someone had pointed him out, someone had laughed, and Victor had turned, amused at first, then curious, then something colder, something sharper. "You've been standing there long enough," Victor added, setting his glass down directly on the piano lid with a soft, deliberate tap. "So go ahead, play." And the word lingered, not an invitation but a test, the kind that didn't offer second chances. A faint chuckle rippled through the crowd, quickly stifled, because no one wanted to be the first to cross that invisible line Victor had just drawn. Elijah's gaze shifted, not to the billionaire, but to the instrument itself, the black lacquer reflecting fragments of the room like broken mirrors, the keys untouched, pristine, as if they belonged to a world he was never meant to enter. His heartbeat slowed, strangely, not racing like it should have, but settling into something steadier, something older, like a rhythm he had known long before this moment, long before this room, long before anyone here had decided who he was allowed to be. Somewhere behind him, a server paused mid-step, a tray hovering in the air, and across the room, a woman in a silver dress tilted her head, studying him with a curiosity that wasn't entirely unkind, just unfamiliar, as if she were watching something that didn't quite fit into the story she expected. Victor leaned slightly against the edge of the piano, one hand resting casually near the keys, his posture relaxed, confident, certain of the outcome before it had even begun. "One mistake," he said quietly, almost conversationally, but loud enough for the room to hear, "and you're done." And that was when Elijah moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, then another, leaving the bucket behind, leaving the wall, leaving the safe, invisible space he had occupied all night, until he stood in front of the piano, close enough to see his reflection in the glossy surface, close enough to notice the faint smudge he had missed earlier, a small imperfection no one else would have seen. His hand lifted, hovering just above the keys, not touching yet, not claiming anything, just existing in that fragile space between expectation and possibility, while the room held its breath, waiting for him to prove exactly what they already believed. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room like a weight that pressed gently against every shoulder, every breath measured, every eye fixed on the same quiet figure standing at the piano, as if time itself had slowed to watch what he would do next. Elijah Carter's hand remained suspended above the keys, not trembling, not rushed, just hovering there with a stillness that felt deliberate, as though he understood something no one else in that room did. And in that stillness, there was history, not visible but present, layered beneath the surface like notes waiting to be heard. He had stood in rooms like this before, not inside them, but just beyond, in hallways lined with muted carpets and service doors, where music would spill out in fragments when the doors opened, where laughter and applause echoed down corridors he was paid to clean, not to enter. Years ago, when he was 12, he used to press his ear against the upright piano in his grandmother's living room, a scratched wooden instrument that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, its keys worn down from decades of use, some sticking, some uneven, but all of them alive in a way that felt like they were speaking directly to him. She had never called herself a teacher, never used formal words or structured lessons. She would just sit beside him on a narrow bench and guide his hands gently, showing him how to listen before he played, how to feel the pause between notes, how silence could carry meaning just as much as sound. "Do not rush the music," she would say, her voice soft but certain, because the music already knows where it is going. And he had believed her, even when life pulled him away from that small room, even when the piano was sold, even when bills and responsibilities replaced the quiet afternoons that used to stretch endlessly with nothing but melody and light. Back in the present, the polished black grand piano in front of him reflected none of that history, none of that warmth. It stood pristine and untouchable, an object of status rather than memory. And yet his fingers recognized it in a way that went beyond surface, as if the distance between that old upright and this flawless instrument did not matter, as if the language beneath both was exactly the same. Behind him, someone shifted their weight, the faint sound of a shoe against marble echoing louder than it should have, and another guest exhaled slowly, a breath they had been holding without realizing it, while Victor Langford remained where he was, watching, his expression unreadable but his posture unchanged, confident, composed, certain that whatever came next would confirm the boundaries he believed in. Elijah lowered his hand slightly, closer now, close enough that the faint ivory sheen of the keys caught the reflection of his fingertips, and for a brief moment his eyes closed, not in hesitation but in recognition, like someone stepping into a familiar place after years away, grounding himself in something that had never truly left. The room seemed to contract around that single movement. Conversations that had once filled the space now reduced to a memory, replaced by a tension that was not loud but dense, as if every person present understood, on some level, that this moment was no longer about a joke, no longer about amusement, but about something quieter and far more unsettling, the possibility that they had misjudged what they were seeing. Elijah inhaled slowly, a steady breath that did not shake, and as he opened his eyes again, there was a clarity in them that had not been there before, not directed at anyone in the room, not seeking approval or permission, but anchored in something internal, something unspoken. And then, with a movement so gentle it almost seemed accidental, his fingers descended the final inch toward the keys, not striking them yet, just resting there lightly, as if reintroducing himself to a voice he had not heard in years, while the entire room leaned forward without realizing it, suspended between doubt and something they could not yet name. The first note did not arrive loudly. It arrived like a breath, soft and precise, so controlled that for a fraction of a second some in the room were not even sure it had been played at all. But then it lingered, clear and deliberate, filling the space between them with a tone so clean it felt almost fragile, and Elijah did not rush to follow it, his fingers resting lightly, as if listening to what he had just released, allowing the sound to settle before moving again. A second note followed, then a third, each placed with the same quiet intention, not hurried, not showy, but exact, as if every key he touched had already been chosen long before this moment. And slowly the shape of something familiar began to form, not yet recognizable to everyone, but enough to shift the energy in the room from amusement to attention. Victor Langford's posture did not change immediately, but the faint smile that had been resting at the edge of his expression lost its certainty, his fingers tapping once against the polished surface of the piano before going still, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if recalculating something he had assumed would be simple. Across the room, a man who had been leaning casually against the bar straightened without realizing it, his glass hovering midair, while the woman in the silver dress tilted her head further, her earlier curiosity now sharpened into focus, because what she was hearing did not match the story she had been told by appearances alone. Elijah's hands moved with increasing confidence, but never with excess, each motion economical, grounded, his wrists relaxed, his posture steady, as though the instrument was not something he was trying to impress, but something he was simply returning to, something that recognized him as much as he recognized it. The melody unfolded with clarity now, the structure undeniable, a classical piece shaped by discipline and memory, its phrasing controlled, its timing exact, and yet there was something beneath it that felt personal, a subtle shift in emphasis, a breath held slightly longer here, a transition softened there, details that did not break the piece but instead revealed an understanding that went beyond imitation, A quiet murmur attempted to rise from one corner of the room, then died before it could take form, because no one wanted to interrupt what was happening. Not now. Not when the certainty they had all shared moments ago was beginning to fracture in real time. Victor's gaze remained fixed on Elijah's hands, not his face, not his uniform, but his hands, as if the truth of the situation could only be found there, in the precise way his fingers moved across the keys without hesitation, without searching, without doubt. The chandelier light above caught the edges of the piano, reflecting faint glimmers across the room. But now those reflections felt secondary, background to something far more immediate, the sound itself, which had grown fuller, more confident, filling the space with a presence that did not ask for permission. Elijah's breathing remained steady, almost invisible, his focus inward, anchored not in the room, not in the eyes watching him, but in the sequence unfolding beneath his fingertips, each note connecting to the next with an inevitability that could not be faked, could not be improvised without years of understanding behind it. And in that moment, the room was no longer watching a janitor being tested. It was watching something it could not easily categorize, something that did not fit into the roles it had already assigned. And the silence that had once carried doubt now carried something else entirely, something heavier, something closer to realization. As the final notes of the phrase approached, and Elijah's hands hovered for just a fraction longer before continuing, leaving no room for dismissal, no space for the certainty that had existed only minutes before. The music did not stop, it expanded, unfolding into a fuller expression that filled the high ceiling and settled into the corners of the room, like something that belonged there all along. And Elijah's hands moved with a quiet certainty that no longer needed to prove itself, each passage flowing into the next with balance and restraint, never rushed, never exaggerated, as though he was not performing for the people watching but honoring something far more personal. A subtle shift in tempo came, delicate but intentional, and with it the melody deepened, revealing layers that many in the room could recognize but few could truly understand. Because this was no longer about technical precision alone, it was about interpretation, about feeling carried through discipline, about memory translated into sound. Victor Langford's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the faint crease between his brows forming as he leaned forward just slightly, no longer resting casually against the piano. His earlier ease replaced by a stillness that suggested focus, calculation, and something he had not expected to encounter. Because this was not a mistake, not a lucky sequence, not something that could be dismissed with a smirk or a comment. It was sustained, consistent, undeniable. A man near the back of the room, older, silver-haired, someone who had spent decades attending private concerts and exclusive recitals, slowly lowered his glass and whispered under his breath, not to anyone in particular but to himself, a single word that carried weight, recognition, and disbelief. And though the whisper was barely audible, it seemed to ripple outward, altering the atmosphere in a way no one could ignore. The woman in the silver dress shifted her stance, her arms no longer loosely folded but drawn closer to her body, as if she were bracing against the realization forming in her mind. Her gaze fixed not on Elijah's uniform, but on the movement of his hands, the subtle lift of his fingers, the controlled descent onto each key. The absence of hesitation that could not be taught in a moment, that could not be improvised under pressure. Elijah remained unaware of their reactions, or perhaps he chose not to acknowledge them. His focus anchored entirely within the music, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed, the years between his past and this present moment collapsing into a single continuous line, as if the distance had never existed at all. The chandelier light above flickered softly against the polished surface of the piano, casting reflections that shifted with each movement. But even that felt secondary now, background to the sound that had taken control of the room, a sound that no longer asked for attention because it commanded it without effort. Victor's hand, which had been resting near the edge of the instrument, slowly withdrew, his fingers curling slightly, as if reconsidering their place there. As if the piano was no longer an object he owned in this moment, but something he was witnessing alongside everyone else. Something he could not interrupt without revealing more than he intended. The melody approached a transition, a passage that required precision not only in speed but in restraint, and Elijah navigated it with a calm that bordered on effortless, his touch light yet assured, the notes connecting seamlessly, each one placed with intention, and as the phrase resolved, there was a brief, suspended pause, not empty but full, charged with the weight of what had just been established. No one moved, no one spoke, because the understanding had begun to take shape, slow but irreversible, that what stood before them was not defined by the uniform, not limited by the role they had assigned, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was aware, heavy with the realization that something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by a simple dismissal or a careless remark, as Elijah's hands hovered once more above the keys, ready to continue, leaving the room suspended between what they had believed and what they were now beginning to see. The next passage arrived without warning, faster, sharper, the tempo rising just enough to shift the emotional ground beneath the room, and Elijah's fingers responded with precision that bordered on instinct, each note landing exactly where it belonged, not chasing the music, but moving ahead of it, guiding it, shaping it into something that felt alive rather than rehearsed. A quiet tension returned to the air, not the earlier kind rooted in doubt, but a different kind, one built from disbelief, from the mind struggling to reconcile what it was hearing with what it thought it knew. And that tension moved through the guests in subtle ways, a tightened jaw here, a slight shift in posture there, a glass set down more carefully than before. Victor Langford exhaled slowly, the breath measured but noticeable, his gaze no longer fixed only on Elijah's hands, but lifting, searching for something else, something that might explain what was unfolding in front of him, yet finding nothing that fit within the structure he had relied on for so long. Elijah's expression did not change. His focus remained inward, his shoulders relaxed, his posture steady, as though the increasing complexity of the piece did not demand effort, but simply revealed what had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. The melody twisted into a more intricate sequence, a series of notes that required not just accuracy but control over dynamics, the kind of control that separates repetition from understanding. And Elijah moved through it seamlessly, his fingers rising and falling with a rhythm that felt both disciplined and deeply personal, like a conversation he had memorized but was still discovering new meaning in. Somewhere near the center of the room, the older man who had whispered earlier now leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism but in recognition, the kind that comes from years spent listening, evaluating, understanding the difference between someone who plays and someone who communicates. And what he saw now did not leave room for dismissal. The woman in the silver dress lowered her gaze briefly, not out of disinterest, but as if absorbing what she was hearing, her earlier assumptions dissolving into something quieter, something less certain, and when she looked up again, there was no trace of amusement left, only attention, focused and unbroken. Victor's hand, now fully withdrawn from the piano, rested at his side, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, but still, completely still, as though even the smallest movement might disrupt something he did not yet understand. The music surged gently, not overpowering but expanding, filling the space with a presence that could not be ignored. And with each passing second it became more difficult for anyone in the room to maintain the narrative they had arrived with, because the evidence was no longer subtle, no longer forming. It was complete, undeniable, unfolding in real time. Elijah's breathing remained steady, almost imperceptible, his connection to the instrument unbroken, his movements efficient, controlled, and as the passage approached its peak, there was a brief moment where the notes seemed to hang in the air, suspended, as if the music itself was aware of the threshold it had reached. Victor's gaze hardened slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, the kind that arrives slowly but lands with weight. And for the first time since the moment had begun, there was no trace of certainty left in his expression, only the quiet recognition that the situation was no longer under his control. Elijah guided the phrase through its final turn with a restraint that spoke louder than any flourish, choosing precision over display, clarity over excess. And as the sequence resolved, the sound settled into the room with a completeness that left no room for doubt, no space for interpretation, only the undeniable truth of what had just been revealed, as his hands hovered once more above the keys, not yet finished, not yet releasing the moment, while the room remained suspended in a silence that had transformed from expectation into something far more profound. The silence after the last phrase did not feel empty. It felt full, as if the room itself was holding onto the final vibration of the notes, unwilling to let them disappear too quickly, and Elijah did not rush to fill it, his hands still hovering above the keys, fingers relaxed, breathing steady, allowing that space to exist exactly as it was, because he understood something the room was only beginning to grasp, that the pause was part of the music, not an absence of it. The chandelier light above seemed softer now, diffused across the polished surface of the piano, reflecting a faint glow that settled around his hands. And in that quiet, the contrast between what he wore and what he had just done became almost surreal. The simple gray uniform against the instrument that had just carried something far beyond expectation. No one spoke, not even the faintest whisper, because whatever had just unfolded had shifted the balance of the room in a way that words could not immediately follow. And even those who moments ago had been ready to laugh now stood still, their expressions caught somewhere between realization and restraint. Victor Langford remained where he was, but his posture had changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone to point at and name, but enough to be felt. His shoulders no longer carrying the same casual certainty, his stance less anchored in control and more in observation, as if he had stepped back from something without physically moving. His eyes, once measuring, now lingered, not searching for a mistake, not waiting for a flaw, but absorbing what had already been proven. And there was a subtle shift in the way he looked at Elijah, not fully understood yet, not fully accepted, but undeniable in its presence. Elijah lowered his hands slowly, not in surrender, not in completion, but in acknowledgement of the moment, his fingertips lifting from the keys with the same care they had touched them, as though the connection between him and the instrument did not end when the sound did. His gaze dropped briefly to the surface of the piano, catching his own reflection, faint and distorted. A reminder of where he stood and how he was seen. And yet there was no tension in his expression, no need to claim anything, no need to correct the room, because what mattered had already been said without words. Across the room, the older man straightened fully now, his eyes still fixed on Elijah, his earlier skepticism replaced entirely by recognition, the kind that did not need explanation. And beside him, the woman in the silver dress exhaled quietly, a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized, her posture softening as if something inside her had shifted, something small but irreversible. The marble floor beneath them reflected faint outlines of movement, but no one actually moved, not yet, as though the room itself needed a moment longer to understand what it had just witnessed, to reconcile the simplicity of the man with the complexity of what he had revealed. Victor's hand rose slightly, not toward the piano, not toward Elijah, but as if he intended to speak, and then paused midair, the gesture unfinished, because whatever words he might have used no longer felt sufficient, no longer aligned with the weight of the moment. And for perhaps the first time that evening, hesitation entered his presence, quiet but unmistakable. Elijah stepped back a single inch, not leaving, not retreating, just creating space, the same quiet space he had held at the beginning, but now filled with something entirely different, something the room could not ignore or dismiss. And in that stillness, the silence remained, no longer uncertain, no longer expectant, but aware, heavy with the realization that something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not be undone. Victor Langford finally moved, not abruptly, not with the authority that had defined him earlier, but with a measured step forward that seemed to acknowledge the space Elijah had created rather than dominate it. And the subtle shift did not go unnoticed, because in a room built on hierarchy, even the smallest change in posture carried weight. His hand lowered slowly from where it had paused midair, and for a brief moment, he looked at the piano, not as an object of ownership, but as something that had just revealed a truth he could not immediately categorize, something that had slipped past his expectations and settled into something far more difficult to dismiss. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, and his voice, though steady, no longer carried the edge it had before, no longer framed as a challenge or a test, but as a question that required an answer he did not already possess. The room seemed to lean into that question, the silence tightening once more, but differently now, not waiting for failure, but waiting for clarity, for the missing piece that might explain what they had just witnessed. Elijah did not respond right away, his gaze lifting from the piano to meet Victor's for the first time. Not confrontational, not deferential, just direct, and in that look there was no attempt to impress, no effort to justify, only a quiet certainty that did not need reinforcement. At home, he said simply, his voice calm, measured, carrying none of the weight the room tried to place on it. And the answer seemed almost too small for what it followed, too simple to contain the depth of what had just unfolded, yet it held, because it was true. Victor's expression shifted again, a flicker of something crossing his face, not disbelief exactly, but the beginning of recognition, as though the simplicity of the answer forced him to confront something more complex beneath it, something that did not align with the systems he trusted. You studied, Victor continued, pressing slightly, not aggressively but with a need to understand, to place Elijah within a framework that made sense. Conservatory, private instructor, something. And the words trailed just enough to reveal that he expected a familiar answer, something that could be named, something that could be categorized. Elijah shook his head once, small, controlled, his hands now resting at his sides, no longer hovering above the keys, no longer connected to the instrument, but still carrying the memory of it. My grandmother, he said, and this time there was a faint shift in his tone, not emotional, but grounded, as if the name itself carried weight beyond the room, beyond the moment. A quiet murmur passed through the guests, subtle but present, because the answer did not satisfy their expectations. It disrupted them, replacing formal training with something personal, something unstructured, something that did not fit neatly into the narrative they understood. Victor's gaze held steady, but there was a pause now, a longer one, as if he was recalculating again, not the performance, but the person, the distance between what he had assumed and what stood in front of him, narrowing with each second. And you work here, Victor said, the statement more than a question, though the question lingered beneath it, and Elijah nodded once, not elaborating, not expanding, allowing the contrast to exist without explanation. The room absorbed that exchange, the simplicity of it, the imbalance it revealed, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or even heavy. It was reflective, carrying the quiet realization that what they had witnessed was not an exception, not an anomaly, but something that had been overlooked, dismissed before it was ever allowed to be seen. Victor's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in adjustment, his stance shifting from one of control to one of consideration, and for a moment he looked not at Elijah, not at the guests, but at the piano again, as if trying to reconcile its presence with what had just been proven upon it. When his gaze returned, it lingered differently, no longer searching for limits, but acknowledging the absence of them. And though no apology was spoken, no formal recognition declared, the shift was unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but real, settling into the room with the same quiet certainty as the music that had brought them there, leaving no one unchanged, even if they had not yet found the words to admit it. The room did not return to what it had been. It shifted into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every person present had stepped into a version of the evening they had not planned for, and Victor Langford stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze still resting on Elijah, not with judgment, not with distance, but with a focus that suggested something. Internal was being rearranged, something that had not moved in a very long time. He inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less weight of authority and more of intention. You should not be cleaning floors in this building. The words landing carefully, not as an order, not as a dismissal of what Elijah was, but as an acknowledgement of what he had seen. A faint ripple moved through the guests, subtle but unmistakable, because the statement itself broke the structure that had defined the room, replacing hierarchy with recognition, even if only partially, even if still forming. Elijah did not react the way some expected. He did not straighten with pride, did not rush to respond, did not step forward to claim the moment. He simply stood where he was, steady, grounded, his expression unchanged, as though the words, while significant to others, did not alter the way he understood himself. Victor took a small step closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to shift the space between them from public to something more direct, and for the first time, his hand lifted not in hesitation but with purpose, gesturing lightly toward the piano. "Play again," he said, and this time there was no condition attached, no threat, no test, only a request, quiet but clear. The difference settled into the room immediately, changing the way the moment was held, because what had begun as control had now become invitation, and everyone present could feel that shift, even if they did not name it. Elijah's gaze moved briefly to the instrument, then back to Victor, not questioning, not seeking permission, simply acknowledging the request, and after a pause that carried its own weight, he stepped forward again, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same measured calm that had defined him from the beginning. His hands rose once more, hovering above the keys, but this time the space around them felt different, not charged with expectation, not crowded with doubt, but open, as if the room itself had made space for something it had not understood before. When his fingers touched the keys again, the sound that followed was softer, more restrained, not a demonstration, not a statement, but something quieter, something that carried less need to prove and more willingness to exist. And the melody that unfolded was not identical to what had come before. It carried a subtle variation, a shift in phrasing that felt more personal, more reflective, as though he was no longer responding to the room, but to something within himself. Victor did not move this time, did not interrupt, did not measure. He simply listened, his posture still, his expression composed but altered, as if the act of listening itself had become unfamiliar and necessary at the same time. Around them, the guests remained silent, but the silence no longer pressed, it held, gently, allowing the music to move through it without resistance. And in that space, something unspoken settled, not dramatic, not declared, but real. The recognition that what they had witnessed was not a moment to be corrected or controlled, but something to be understood, slowly, fully, and without the assumptions they had carried into the room. The final notes did not rush toward an ending. They settled into it, each tone placed with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce completion. And when Elijah lifted his hands from the keys this time, he did not hover. He simply let them fall naturally to his sides, the connection released without resistance, as if the music had already said everything it needed to say. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed again, no longer filled with tension or disbelief, but with something softer, something reflective, as though every person present had been given a moment they did not expect and were not yet ready to let go of. Victor Langford stood in place, his gaze fixed on the piano for a second longer before shifting back to Elijah. And in that look there was no trace of the earlier challenge, no lingering doubt, only a quiet recognition that did not need to be spoken to exist. He nodded once, small and deliberate, not a command, not a signal to the room, but something more personal, an acknowledgement that carried weight precisely because of how restrained it was. And then he stepped back, just enough to return the space to what it had been before, or at least as close as it could be after what had just happened. Elijah did not wait for applause, did not look around for approval. He turned slightly, his movement unhurried, and for a brief moment his eyes caught the reflection of the chandelier in the polished surface of the piano, light scattering in soft fragments that faded as he stepped away. He walked back toward the place where he had stood at the beginning, toward the quiet corner near the marble wall where the bucket remained, unchanged, exactly where he had left it. And when he reached it, he picked up the handle with the same steady motion he had used countless times before, as if the moment at the piano had not altered the simplicity of what he was there to do. A faint sound followed, not applause, not yet, just the subtle shift of weight as someone adjusted their stance. Then another, until the room slowly began to move again, not in the way it had earlier, with laughter and easy conversation, but more carefully, more aware, as though something invisible had been rearranged and no one wanted to disturb it too quickly. The older man near the center lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect that was not announced but felt, and the woman in the silver dress watched Elijah for a moment longer before turning away, her expression thoughtful, quieter than before. Victor remained where he was, but his attention followed Elijah's movement across the room, not with control, not with expectation, but with a stillness that suggested he was seeing something differently now, something that did not fit within the structure he had built but could no longer be ignored. Elijah resumed his work without ceremony, the cloth returning to his hand, the motion familiar, grounded, the same careful attention applied to the surface of the piano as if it were any other object in the room. Yet the reflection in that surface now held something new, something the room had witnessed and could not unsee. No one stopped him, no one called him back, and he did not look back either, because the moment had already passed, complete in its own quiet way, leaving behind not a declaration, not a victory claimed aloud, but a shift that settled into the space between people, into the way they stood, the way they watched, the way they would remember this night long after the music had faded, as the soft sound of the cloth moving across the polished surface replaced the final echoes of the piano, and the room, though still filled with light and voices beginning to return, carried a silence beneath it, steady and undeniable, like something that had finally been seen.